Lee, and I'm co-director of the Philip Tatey Center, and Ed Nersessian is co-director of the Philip Tatey Center. I am now proud to introduce William. How do you pronounce your name?
Kupinse.
Kupinse. I've been working on this for a few weeks, and I had to have you here to actually get this correct. Dr. Kupinse is Associate Professor of English at the University of Puget Sound. He has published essays on waste in the writing of H.G. Wells and James Joyce, as well as an essay on waste and Indian fiction, which appeared in the collection Filth. He is currently working on a book about literary modernism and waste entitled The Remains of Empire, wonderful title, which brings together cultural studies and eco-critical approaches. His poems on environmental themes have appeared in Green Letters, Cimarron Review, and Cumberland Poetry Review. Dr. Kupinse will moderate today's panel and introduce the other panelists. And we're very delighted that we've had some late additions to the panel due to some other factors beyond our control, and you'll perhaps explain that particular situation.
Sure. Thanks very much. It's my great honor and excitement to be here with such a wonderful array of writers and scholars in dust, to quote a phrase of Charles Dickens's from his novel, Our Mutual Friend. And we did have a few unavoidable cancellations. Bill Rathje was unable to be here, as was John Scanlon, but I think you'll find that the panel that we've assembled today is really just a wonderfully rich resource of knowledge and scholarship and writing on the subject of waste. And I'm just going to briefly introduce each of our panelists so that we can get on with the discussion. Jennifer Gabrys is lecturer in design at Goldsmith College, University of London. She recently completed her PhD thesis, The Natural History of Electronics, which examines the global ecologies of electronic waste. Previously, she practiced landscape architecture and urban design in Los Angeles and Minneapolis. Jennifer's research and practice currently focuses on design ecologies, communication technologies, and material culture. Robin Nagle is anthropologist in residence for New York City's Department of Sanitation. She teaches anthropology and urban studies at NYU, where she also directs the Draper Interdisciplinary Master's Program in Humanities and Social Thought. Her research focuses on the anthropology of garbage, which includes labors of maintenance, landscapes of waste and wealth, material culture, and unmarked processes of urban life. And her book about sanitation workers, with a great title, Picking Up, will be out next year from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Elizabeth Royte is the author of Garbage Land, which incidentally I'm teaching on Tuesday in a class, so it's particularly exciting that she was able to join us here, which was described by Jonathan Miles as falling somewhere between Fast Food Nation and Silent Spring, which is an accolade if I ever heard one. Royte's book traces the roots of contemporary culture's waste to its final and sometimes unlikely destination. Royte is also the author of The Tapir's Morning Bath, Solving the Mysteries of the Tropical Rainforest. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, in Harper's, National Geographic, Outside, the Smithsonian, and numerous other magazines, and she is a former Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellow. And last but not least, Susan Strasser is an historian of everyday life in American consumer society. Her interest in trash grew out of scholarly work on the history of American housework and on the creation of the mass market for household products. She is the author of Never Done, A History of American Housework, Satisfaction Guaranteed, The Making of the American Mass Market, and most relevant to our discussion today, Waste and Want, A Social History of Trash. Her current project, she explores many different fields, is about the culture and commerce of medicinal herbs. I thought I would start out by asking everyone a question that I think each of you has probably been asked at some point before in your life, which is that of the many things one can study in this world, how did you decide to focus on waste? Jennifer, would you like to start us off?
Well, probably most poignantly, it was when I was working as a landscape architect in Los Angeles for the firm Rios, and we were asked to participate in the Fresh Kills landfill competition. So with the closure of Fresh Kills, as you all probably know, the intention was to recycle it into some sort of recreational landscape and environmental sort of center. So I participated in that and was fortunate enough to actually come to Fresh Kills and have a tour of the site. And it really galvanized a lot of things, a lot of sort of understandings about material culture and landscapes. And then I carried that over into a study of electronic waste, which I began when I was doing my PhD. And I was really fascinated by the question of, if we live in such a dematerialized society, or dematerialized material culture, why is it that we still have so much garbage? And I think electronic waste really raised that most, sort of strongly. So.
Yeah, well, wonderful. And we'll explore that in a number of different ways throughout the conversation. Elizabeth, how did you get started?
I'm not a lifelong scholar of waste. I came to it pretty recently, and only I usually write about science and the environment, and I hadn't really thought about writing about garbage until I was paddling in the Gowanus Canal, which many of you may know is a pretty disgusting industrial waterway in Brooklyn. And I was out with the Sierra Club, and they were picking up trash, and I had my young daughter with me, and I was kind of narrating what we were seeing, and I was pointing out types of birds and plants and things like that. And then I started noticing household waste in the canal, organic material, things that should have been recycled, floating human waste. It was after a big rainstorm, so there was an overflow, and electronic waste, household hazardous waste. And I realized that this was all the stuff that I got rid of almost daily, and I realized then, I had this vague idea about following trash, but I didn't know if it could really be a book. But it was then that I realized I could follow all these streams, and it would take the form of adventure travel. So that's when I got, I realized maybe I actually could turn this into a book. So I am new to it, the trash studies.
I think that's one of the things that's very appealing about Garbage Land is the very kind of authentic connection it draws between personal experience and the content of the book as well. Robin, how did you become someone who teaches and researches waste?
Once upon a time, long ago, my father took me camping in the Adirondacks, and it was around the time of the first Earth Day. And we were in this extraordinarily bucolic landscape that seemed untouched by anything human ever. And we round a bend, and there's a lean-to, and behind the lean-to is a little dump. It's the size of perhaps the area that we describe here. And it smelled like a dump, like dumps have the signature smell, and I've learned since then they smell the same way all over the world. There's a top note that's sort of acidic, and there's something funky that might be sour milk, but you don't really want to know what it really. But here we are in this paradise, and there's trash, and I was outraged and very confused. And my question then was, why were the campers who preceded us comfortable to leave behind this debris, and who was supposed to come and pick it up? What were they thinking about the next step? Obviously, aluminum foil and tin cans and worn out sneakers are not going to decompose. So if you ask them, okay, you leave it, who's coming for it? What would their answer have been? So that question kind of, it was planted then. And then much later, it grew into the research project that I now am in the middle of with the Department of Sanitation, which is the same question but writ large. Who picks up after us?
Yeah.
Who are they?
And a fascinating question, too, that I will touch on, I think, in a lot of different ways. And Susan, how did you get involved in one of your many areas of study being trash?
Well, my many areas of study are, to me, all one in a way. It's different takes on the same set of questions, and I kind of see my book on housework and my book on the mass market and my book on trash as a trilogy, and one grew out of the other. I studied housework, the history. I'm a historian, and in studying the history of housework, I realized pretty early that what I was studying was the creation of the market for consumer products, so I did that explicitly the second time and really did the research for that book during the 80s, and along with everybody else was becoming more environmentally aware at that point, and the garbage barge, the Mobro was during the time that I was doing that research, and Chernobyl, Bhopal, various environmental events, and I became more and more convinced that my next project should be about the environmental, I mean, that these first two projects had been about product introduction, and that I then wanted to go into what the environmental effects of that were.
Sure, so sort of looking at things at all of the stages of their trajectories throughout our lives.
Right.
Yeah. If it's not impolite to answer one's own question, I have been interested in garbage for quite a while. I think I may have had one of those kind of formative moments as you describe, Robin. I do recall going on vacation, this is sort of a version of that with my family, and picking up returnable cans in Vermont, which at that time I think was the only place around that you could do that, maybe New Hampshire and Maine as well, and just thinking that it was sort of amazing that something that was discarded could have a kind of value. So I think that was something that maybe triggered my initial interest. And then as a graduate student, we spent a great deal of time studying that triumvirate of race, class, and gender. But eco-criticism, the study of the environment, wasn't really playing into graduate programs at the time I was studying. It was just beginning to. So I think my own interest in ecology was starting to intersect with literary studies, and I was just trying to feel my way around. I've developed that a bit. I try to incorporate into my teaching and to make students very aware of waste. Next week we're going to be visiting some worm bins that we have on the campus of the University of Puget Sound that digest a lot of our food waste, and this is a student project that they started on their own. But I have students do things like carry their garbage with them in a clear plastic bag for a week and that sort of thing as a way of reflecting. It's great. By the end, I tell them, if they go to the library, their garbage goes to the library. If they go on a date, their garbage goes on a date as well. And I do it too, which is also sort of around the same time that I started composting too, because.
And then do you all bring it together?
We bring it to class and we talk about it, we look at it, we write about it. So I tell them nothing illegal and nothing sharp in there, but that's it. So, well, maybe we should talk a little bit about what waste is. I think that sometimes the most seemingly obvious questions are actually the most interesting questions. It occurs to me that in each of our work, waste probably means something a little bit different to us. So I'd like to hear what it means. And maybe we don't have to necessarily always go in the same order, but if someone would just like to begin. And I'm also curious, what is the difference between waste for you and garbage and trash and rubbish and detritus and filth and every other kind of word that we use for the things that we abject or that we throw away? It's almost like, the 30 different words for snow or something. We're a culture that's very rich in terms for the things that we discard.
Susan's written a bit about the difference between rubbish and garbage and the dry and the wet. And
yeah, I actually just, I did enough research in the writing of the first people to be concerned with municipal solid waste to I decided to follow their lead, which was basically to use the word garbage for organic waste. And the rest of the words, I think I'm pretty, I go around with them, but I really do. Again, following the lead of people who thought about it in a technical sense and were more concerned about what to do with it than I was. That organic waste really is a different kind of thing.
A different kind of thing. Is the distinction between garbage and other forms of trash something that, for example, the New York City Department of Sanitation is interested and aware of right now? This could be either for Elizabeth or for Robin. I'm just thinking.
Well, I'm thinking in the past, and when New York first separated garbage into three, the ash bins, which were, they call that, rubbish was dry. They use it for landfill, right? That was dry fill. And then wet material was cooked into fertilizer, and it had a use, it had a value. I mean, it all had a value. But now, well, you can talk about what's happening now in their categories.
Well, the sanitation now, there are two lumps of recyclables. There's paper, and then there's plastic, metal, and glass, which this city organizes as what's called a single stream recycling effort. And then there's garbage, which is everything else.
But they call it collections.
Yes, the truck is a collection truck. The word garbage is actually rarely used in any sanitation context in any kind of official way. When you're hired into the job and you go through training, it's mentioned really almost not at all during the weeks that you're learning the machinery and the protocols and whatnot.
Because it's pejorative?
No, it's almost like it's so central to what you're doing that you don't need to talk about it. It's like when you study anthropology after the first introductory course, you never again talk about what is culture, or rarely do you talk about what is culture. It's the stuff of your job. It's the stuff of your life on the job. They are called commodities, so that there's the garbage is a particular commodity, paper is a different commodity, and in the paperwork side of things, you code those differently in terms of what's being collected, which dump is it tipped at, how is it transported. Those things all have implications for the organization of the labor around it, of course.
I was sharply rebuked over and over again in reporting my book for using the word garbage. People repeatedly said, it's not garbage, it's waste.
Fascinating.
I haven't encountered that.
Waste itself is interesting, though, because I mean, it refers both to that excess of something or superabundance of something, but its etymology is also from an empty field, right, from land that is not fertile. So it's also an absence of the thing as well. It's one of those weird words, I guess cleave maybe would be another, that means itself and the opposite. So I'm just sort of fascinated when we talk about this, what exactly we're thinking of.
Well, that's the thing too that Michael Thompson captures in Rubbish Theory, I think, so well, is that it is a dynamic and changeable category. And really you could think about anything in this room being potentially waste and then being potentially recovered. So it's that moment when it's actually classified that it starts to have some utility, that it can lapse in and out of that.
Waste equals food. William McDonough says, everything is a feedstock for something else. New things can't grow without the decay of, microorganisms doing their work. Food waste is, feeding the land to grow new things. The metal here can be recycled to grow new whatever. There's no waste in nature, that whole idea.
Yeah.
Not so true of plastics, though.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some things that
Plastics
can't be, you call plastic, right, Satan's resin in your book?
Well, I was quoting the Berkeley Ecology Center, they call it that. But there could be new types of plastic that are food for other things.
I teach a class called Garbage in Gotham, and we have a similar exercise as your students have to go through with weights. It's a little different, but I'm going to actually imitate yours, I think.
I'm imitating someone else.
Okay.
How are you going to change yours?
Well, I have my students collect their waste for 3 days, and anything that, if you can flush it, you don't bring it in, and if you recycle it, you don't bring it in. But otherwise, you hold on to it for 3 days and then bring it in, and we excavate it. But that's voluntary because the excavations can be, as you know, extremely revealing and very personal. And they don't have to tip it onto the table if they don't want to. But gosh, I completely lost my
It's
point.
almost a rewriting of Gulliver's Travels, isn't it? Everybody had to carry the objects that they wanted to speak with. It's almost like a kind of, everybody has to carry the decayed objects that they've used in the process of their everyday life, and that tells the story about their everyday life.
But I'm going to make them do it for a week now. But in that class,
And carry it everywhere.
And carry it
I like
everywhere.
that.
That sounds like the magic of that assignment. In that class, one of the first things we read is John Locke on, I forget which chapter of the Second Treatise on Government, but he talks about waste. He defines waste. And he's referring basically to the American landscape, the American continent. And it is unworked, to him, it's unworked land. And it's such an interesting definition because you can carry it forward and speculate in all these creative ways about, well, if something is unworked, is it wasted or is it wasteful to leave something untouched? Of course, now we have wildly different definitions. An untouched wilderness is something to preserve and honor and maybe even stay out of, to just leave it be. But the malleability of the definition, and like what Thompson talks about, is part of the richness of the study of it. And your book documents that so well across 150 years of how that category changed.
Jennifer, would you like to talk a little bit about electronic waste? Because I almost feel that I mean, it's a related category certainly, but there's something about the dematerial, the unmaterial quality of some of it, the information that we're so surrounded by and perhaps overwhelmed by daily, that's ethereal and that doesn't really exist in any one place. And then there's, as you pointed out, the quite material detritus of the machines that allow us to share that information.
I mean, that's the interesting thing is the sense that we're living in this information society, this information economy, that we're in a post-industrial era, and perhaps we don't even really require materials in order to achieve some sort of profitability. And it's quite a powerful mythology. So it's something I wanted to crack into, and I thought electronic waste was actually a very good way to do that, because you have the remainders of something that's actually quite invisible, which is the whole manufacture, consumption, and disposal of something that almost seems not to exist. It sort of recedes from view. I don't think we even notice most electronics, even though we're surrounded by devices that are potentially electronic waste. And the volume, too, it's considered the fastest growing waste stream, although it's not the biggest in volume. I think in the US it's estimated that by 2010 there'll be 3 billion consumer electronics that will be disposed of. Often many of those are actually stockpiled. As much as 75% of electronics are actually kept in closets because people don't quite know what to do with them. Should they recycle them? It seems they have some value. So a lot of people have, 2, 3 computers actually sitting in their closets. It's one of these things we shuffle around, we don't quite know what to do with. And at each of those moments, each of those sort of staging areas, you start to see different relations to the materiality of electronics. That's really quite interesting.
I think they sit in the closets also because they cost so much to begin with, and
No,
really,
Right.
yeah, exactly, and it's sort of through no doing of your own that they become obsolete. It's just
Moore's
That's a
Law
good point.
every 18
right, you
months.
didn't break it, you didn't, yeah.
You
Yeah,
didn't
it still
decide it no
works.
longer worked with the
Yeah.
platform you're
Yeah,
using for
someone
the...
else said you...
right. Time for Windows Vista now.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's why we hang on.
And that's exactly, there's so many different ways in which your computer could become obsolete or your electronics could become obsolete, from the operating system to the hardware to the, and Bruce Sterling writes about this in his sort of discussion of dead media, with, all of the ways in which the systems can fail and the hardware can fail.
Then there's just, the school where I work at NYU has a 4-year cycle. Every 4 years you get a new computer. So I got the email last week, you're due for a new computer. And I said, well, that's great, but I'm happy with my computer. Can we skip this? And if it dies or breaks in a year or two, could I come to you then? He said, no, you're going to get a new computer now. Which kind do you want? And then he reassured me that my perfectly good computer would not be thrown out, it would not be dismantled, it would be donated probably to some worthy cause. But I don't want a new computer, and I am compelled to get a new computer.
Well, if you kept it and used it, and then you wanted a new one, they would say you have to wait till your cycle, 4-year cycle?
Yes.
Yeah, the same thing happened to me this year.
And you
actually.
can't guarantee yourself that you'll
Of
be
course.
okay for 4 years.
Of course. I mean, by then it's an 8-year-old computer, which isn't that awfully old? Isn't that like due for museum collection somewhere?
I also got a new computer this year too. It's my 4th year at my university.
I guess
That's what they figured out. And what the technician told me when he was installing it was that it would be used somewhere else, I think donated, but not actually to our institution, because the older computers slow the network down. So in fact, there's a way that they need to be moved into a different place. I'd never heard this before either. So it was sort of interesting that they're almost a kind of impediment to speed in their own network. What happens when what's the ethical thing to do? Should we, after we've donated them, or if they're too old to donate? I also have one in my basement that I know that nobody wants. Can we recycle these things? And if so, where would that happen?
Well, there's no easy solution to what the ethical practice is to do with your old computer, and that's what's so tricky about it. You can recycle them. That doesn't necessarily ensure that they're being recycled in the best of conditions, and that doesn't ensure that they won't be sent eventually to China, which is where as much as 80% of first world waste, electronic waste, ends up, is in China, in India, where the raw materials markets are. And of course, there's also donations to third world countries for their use of the computers, but that leaves them in the end with obsolete electronics that probably have a few extra years on them. Then they have to actually deal with the electronic waste.
And they have fewer environmental safeguards.
So they may
there.
have, improper processing for those at their end of life.
But there is a group in the U.S. that handles computer e-waste responsibly. I think it's called the Basel Action Network, and they have a list of e-waste recyclers who've signed what they call the Pledge of True Stewardship, which they pledge not to export any material, not to, what are the three things? Not to use prison labor, which is an important point, and not to landfill any hazardous material in this country or anywhere.
And in the EU, the laws are much more rigorous.
Right,
and if
take
you,
back.
the manufacturer has to agree to take back the device, and when they send them overseas for recycling, the laws of the recycling country cannot be less stringent than those of the originating country. So if Belgium sends it to, I don't know where, to India, the rules governing the recycling and the dismantling have to meet Belgian and EU worker safety standards and environmental standards.
I mean, those policies are in place, but it's actually quite tricky making sure that they're enforced, I think. And so you hear about infractions all the time about, sort of British computers turning up in Nigeria, and people have managed to get into the hard drive and get people's banking details. So, and it's sort of returning in this strange way to the UK again. The BBC did something on this. So you do find out about the waste in these really sort of off-the-wall ways, really.
There was a proposal offered at the conference side of an event called Waste Expo. The year I heard this, it was in Las Vegas, and it was, Waste Expo is a gathering of 10,000 or so waste industry professionals. And it ranges from people who manage landfills and sell trucks to municipal solid waste managers and sort of everybody else. And they have a conference component to it where you go and listen, and, like any conference. So this fellow, I forget everything about him except his proposal, which was take e-waste and put it into mines that have been tapped out, they're empty, they're unused. Just throw it in there and fill the mines up. And then mine the waste for the metals and the components that are reusable. Copper, for instance, is a huge percentage of global copper goes into the manufacture of electronics now, and it's 100% recyclable. There's no loss of quality when you use it again and again. So we should ostensibly be able to simply not have to mine fresh virgin copper. But so this guy said, just throw it into mines, and when the mines fill, we'll go in after it. And I was sure I misheard him, because it just seemed absurd. So I leaned to the person next to me and I said, did he just say? And she said, yeah, that's what he just said. So it made some headlines in the trade waste newspapers and magazines, and then nothing happened to it. And I thought, that's correct. But then I began reading more about the problems of e-waste, and I began to wonder if maybe it's not such a harebrained idea. If you built in environmental safeguards that would prevent groundwater from being further degraded, those kinds of very serious questions. Could you do it? I don't know. What we have so far kind of doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well, the scale at which you would be able to extract those metals it's actually, I mean, they said that if you could take all of the gold out of the microchips that's left, you'd be a billionaire or even more. But actually, you have to process those in such a precise way that to think that you'd be able to have this formless mass and just extract it is actually quite tricky. And then further to that, it actually ignores the kind of irreversible side effects that occur from the manufacturing of electronics, and it's incredibly hazardous. I don't know if most people know, but it involves countless chemicals and materials. Yeah.
It involves dipping wires in acid and that sort of thing. And as someone who actually lives in the shadow of a former Superfund, or a current, I think, Superfund site, the Asarco copper mill in Washington, I know that even when it's done in the original form, it's quite a sort of toxic process. You'd have to weigh the mining and separating that out from what the kind of baseline extraction costs would be.
So why is HP demanufacturing computers here in the U.S. and why is it Sweden that is doing so much of this? They take a lot of e-waste and they get out the tiniest bits of wires and beryllium and all these heavy metals and things. Is it financially worth it to them, or is it because of environmental scrutiny, or why do they Because HP has a couple of these giant plants that are recovering all
Well,
this
more
stuff.
and more companies do have take-back programs now, and I think it's a response to the criticisms, the environmental criticisms, and also that there probably is an opportunity there, not just in recovering raw materials, but I think in the end thinking about how to redesign electronics so that they aren't so hazardous, so that they are more modular and perhaps can be adapted, upgraded without so much, you know, sort of detrimental effect.
In Europe, right, they passed the Restriction of Hazardous Substances Act, so they're cutting down on the number of toxic hazardous things in computers. So, and Dell has a great take-back program, and they're making a green computer now. So for anyone in this room wants to know who has the best take-back program, in this country you can send back about 50 pounds of e-waste to Dell, either for free or for $10, I can't remember. And they give you a box and you pack it up, and UPS will come to your house and pick it up and send it to Dell. And it doesn't have to be Dell equipment.
Interesting.
What's
Well,
a
that's
green
good.
computer?
Yeah.
It has fewer toxic
Bad
components,
things.
and it's easier to take apart.
And Greenpeace has a guide to green electronics too, if people are interested kind of in the whole sort of gamut of electronics and what's more hazardous and what's not. So
Interesting. Since we often use these electronic devices for communication, for channeling our creativity in different ways, I wondered if we could talk a little bit about waste and the creative process, whether that's your own creative process as it relates to the subject matter, or whether it's the creativity and imagination of people that you've met during your research or your travels.
Well, I have a third take on waste.
Or
and the
a
creative-
third or fourth take,
and
yes.
the creative process.
Yeah.
Which is a really central point of my book about waste, and to me one of the most interesting and challenging things that I came to as I was writing, which involves the fact that the period of time that I'm interested in is the transition from handwork to machine work, from pre-industrial to industrial society. And I came to see that handwork involves or implies or comes along with an understanding of what to do with waste. That if you know how to sew, you know how to fix clothing. If you know how to knit, you know how to fix, you know how to mend something knitted. If you know how to do carpentry, you know how to fix things. And that when we as a culture, we as individuals within the culture lost that connection to handwork, we lost those skills for fixing.
And for saving the materials?
In addition, we saved materials. And people saved materials because they might come in handy for fixing things. People saved materials because they might come in handy for making new things. And now that kind of bricolage, to use a trendy word for it, although I want to use it in its really most literal sense, really is that's considered something artists do rather than something everybody does. And really what I came to see as I was working on this topic was that it was something that virtually everybody did, and that was part of the culture, the notion that it involves just a completely different kind of relationship to the material world.
The other thing, well, one of the many things I find so rich about that book, all your work, but I won't gush about it right now, that a relationship to handwork and to tool use and knowing how to use which tool for which job implies a very different kind of relationship to time. What you hear people say now is, oh, I don't have the time to fix, to sew, to mend, to guard, to nurture, to husband. All of those things imply a different pace of daily life, and the disposability on which we rely. We don't even rely on it thinking in the morning, okay, it's still safe to throw out my coffee cup. We completely take for granted that that perpetual shedding. I mean, think about, I often say the only time we don't create trash is while we sleep. And even then, you could argue in some cases, babies, with diaper, whatever. So, but that points to this very new and very hyper-fast pace of daily life. Who has time to knit, for heaven's sakes? I happen to be a passionate knitter, and people look at me a little askance, like, wow. You have time? You must be wasting your life if you have time to make a pair of socks.
Yeah, it is interesting that the phrase is a waste of time. It's almost like those handicraft skills and the ability to use those.
You should be doing something important.
Right. Those tools absorb the category of waste so that it in fact doesn't exist in the same way. So.
Don't changing living patterns also have something to do with when people moved to cities and didn't have room to hold on to things?
For sure. For sure. But that transition, I mean, it was all of a piece, really.
Yeah.
It all happened during the same, in the United States, during the same 50 years, between about 1870 and 1920.
There's lots of things I would love to save now, and I might have time, but not the space to hold on to whatever.
I mean, of course, that raises the question about older technologies and the way in which those operate on matter. I mean, we were just talking about electronic waste, but really the whole set of industrial production in the commodity form and seriality and all of that really is part of patterns of waste and the way that waste emerges with material culture, which I think you raise in your book. And the way that you talk about, too, the way that Baudelaire and Benjamin rag pick through the debris of modern culture as a creative act, as a way to kind of capture the imaginative power of those commodities that's really lost is really strong.
I'm teaching an undergraduate class right now called The Invisible Metropolis. And I've organized it around 4 different themes: nature, history, structure, and sensation. Meaning, how do you interpret an urban space by its smell, by the kind of gut level reaction you get from it. We are at the beginning of October having a tour on the streets with some local freegans. And freegans, as you may know, are people who have a very interesting and radical critique of capitalism that rejects the necessity of purchasing things new and will use used clothing, used furniture, and even, and they're most famous for, food that they find in dumpsters and in the trash. It's not quite as icky as it might seem because they tend to frequent the dumpsters outside of grocery stores, places, you know, high-end delis, places that sell packaged goods. And on the best buy date, like let's say that ice cream is not supposed to be sold after September 15th, close of business today, that ice cream will be thrown away. So then the freegans know, all right, this is what time Gourmet Garage closes and its dumpsters are full, and we're going to be there to forage and scavenge. And they're kind of reclaiming a much older practice throughout human history. It's been a common way people have gleaned resources. But it's my students are already very anxious about it. They've asked, they can't wait. They write, you know, this is so exciting. I'm waiting for their parents to contact the dean and say, we're paying all this tuition and you're taking my children through the trash of the streets. But they're also, one said, do we have to actually get into the dumpster? And I said, no, if you don't want to, you don't have to. And she said, because there are going to be rats, aren't there? And I said, well, we might see some rats and then maggots and then, you know, the sort of frightening side of decay and rot, and it's right there, and we're going to get in the... Well, it's not quite... I mean, the freegans are very skilled at teaching their thought without frightening people. So I think it's going to be a... If any of you want to experience a freegan tour, they give tours, they give public tours. Some, the media are included, some the media are explicitly excluded. They're very savvy about how the media want to twist them into a kind of a sensational, you know, people who go through trash and eat food. That's just disgusting. Anyway, go on their website, freegans.org, and you'll find all the tour.
No, I'm fascinated, and that is quite a creative approach to thinking about our relationship to material culture. I mean, you could only imagine that there are certain parts of the world in which that would even be possible, that there would be that kind of excess. And I mean, that makes me think a bit about the relationship between national identity. I don't want to leave the idea of creativity behind too quickly, but maybe there's a way of segueing back into that. But it seems like our disposal patterns tell us a lot about who we are as Americans, as citizens of the developed world. And I was wondering...
Ask a sanitation worker which neighborhoods are best for Mongo. You remember this.
The wealthier, rich people produce more trash.
If you want to find really good stuff on the streets that you can take home and use because it's not really that dented or broke. I passed on the way here the most beautiful butcher block on wheels. It was dusty, but gosh, it was otherwise just, it was fine. I was already late. But in terms of the creative reuse of things that are otherwise categorized as waste, Mongo, which is slang in New York and Boston, and I don't think anywhere else, and no one can tell me the root of the word, including editors of the American Slang Dictionary. But it just means things that you've decided, things that you find as trash that you decide to redeem and keep, and they're no longer trash. It can be a noun or a verb. Do you Mongo? No, I Mongo. Oh, look, there's Mongo. But this, I think, is very creative and a little risky, because there's a little bit of stigma, like, what? You pick that up off the street?
Sure.
It's great.
Yeah, and that's something that I imagine that sanitation workers engage in as well, that they get the sort of first pick at this sort of thing.
But are they officially allowed to?
No, it's illegal. Within department rules, it's illegal. But I asked the commissioner about that long ago, and he said, Mongo is fine. You don't want to mess with Mongo. If somebody is really messing up on the job and they want to get him, and he does Mongo, they'll get him for Mongo. But it's a little bit of an arbitrary enforcement of the rules.
What about those who Mongo, that's the first time I've used it, and then
You did it just right. That was just right.
adapt or transform that Mongo, the way that we take raw materials of whatever kind and transform them into a creative process? I'm interested in visual art and literary art and all art forms that begin with waste as their raw material or their sort of baseline substance, their media. Is that something anyone's worked with here?
You hear so much about artists working with recyclable materials, and I don't know. I think it's fine, but I don't like it when people think the artists believe that they're doing the earth some good by making art out of used videotape cassettes or things like that. Because it's sure the stuff they're keeping some things out of the landfill, but it is such a minuscule drop in the bucket that the idea that we can. And it's preventing them from buying other supplies, I suppose. Like when our kids make art out of found objects, and then we don't have to go to the store to buy spools and dowels and things. But I don't know. I'm a little impatient with the idea that garbage art. I don't know. Does Merrill Euclid call it that?
Well, there is an artist in residence for the New York City Department of Sanitation, Merrill Latterman Euclides, Ukles. She's brilliant. She's been the artist in residence for 30 years this year. Yeah, and she doesn't call it garbage art because she's not working with. Her first big project was called Touch Sanitation, and she went to every single sanitation garage in the city of New York. There are 59 of them, and at the time there were 8,000 uniformed sanitation workers. And she spent 2 years shaking hands with every single one of them and saying, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." She then did a project where she took all their gloves, a pair of gloves from every worker, and she plasticized them, and she created these most amazing sort of sculptural forms with them. Her work has always been about the intersection of social practice, definitions of and understandings of waste, and the people who take it away, the labor required to keep the waste stream flowing. So she doesn't use found objects that way, although she has a fantastic project now with Fresh Kills, that if Fresh Kills, once the lawsuits are settled and it does move forward into its next iteration, her work, I think, could be a revolutionary contribution to that.
Interesting. And I would guess that the sense is not that her use of found objects or her use of whatever materials that she's taking from the sites that she's working with are going to make a difference, but it's the symbolic act itself that's really making a difference.
She has a truck.
Yeah.
She took a truck and paneled it with mirrors, and it's a social sculpture. Well, she calls landfills social sculptures. We all contributed to Fresh Kills. But when you see the truck in a parade, you see yourself on the side of the truck. Yeah. And it's exactly her effort to make us understand our participation in the blatantly visible but invisibilized processes of waste.
Susan?
It's my impression that, and I could easily be wrong about this, that Picasso and Braque in making collages were the first celebrated fine artists to play with that.
Sure.
And I guess I've always been struck by how that also came in during that same transitional period when it used to be something everybody did. Use found objects all the time. You know, so during that same transition when people were not doing that so much, then it became elevated to something that artists did.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, my figures work around the same time period roughly, but I think of James Joyce's Ulysses, which is a book that tries to represent the detritus of contemporary or then contemporary consciousness. It's filled with garbage. There's trash that's just circulating throughout the text from a product called Plumtree's Potted Meat, which is sort of the spam of the Edwardian period. It appears in a newspaper advertisement. The protagonist, Leopold Bloom, finds it on an obituary page, and he thinks that that's an odd place to advertise it, but it comes to signify other things, the affair that Bloom's wife is having with another man. And there's another piece of garbage that's circulating through the text. It's a biscuit tin that gets thrown at Bloom by a hyper sort of jingoistic character, and it's a biscuit tin from the Jacobs Biscuit Company that would have actually carried the British flag as its symbol on it. So it's this, and Bloom is both Irish and Jewish, so he's sort of doubly mediated by his colonial and other relationship. But the idea that this would somehow fill a work of high canonical modernist literature, I think it's something that really does represent a kind of transformation in the materials that are available to an artist and then what they do with it as well. I wonder if there's a risk, though, at aestheticizing waste, and I'm thinking of, it figures into so many different poems and novels, and is the danger that we make it something that becomes viewable solely as a kind of aesthetic experience, that we look upon a landfill and see? There is a kind of technological sublime, I think, that even though we experience a revulsion, I think that art teaches us in a way how to see the world, and that's at least a possibility worth considering.
Well, I think that's the question that Elizabeth raised when she was reacting to that kind of aestheticization of garbage art, if I understood what you were saying correctly. And then, the ways in which waste is transformed can raise all kinds of other social, ecological, political questions that maybe are obscured in the commodity form. So to just deal with found objects without kind of unpacking those stories is perhaps, a bit facile, which is what I think Benjamin does so well, is he actually, drawing on the surrealists, tries to recuperate that kind of wish image of the commodity that he said was expressed both upon its making, when it's novel, and upon its death. It's kind of a last sigh when something dies, and you see that wish image, which is the kind of promise of commodities that you get with that reification. So to not actually grapple with that, which I think Euclides does grapple with, those social, political, ecological questions, is maybe to betray, garbage in a sense.
So it needs to sort of carry its effective trace for us to understand what its place is.
Perhaps in that transformation to be as rich as it could be.
Every culture has definitions of things that are repulsive. Eating a tree slug in the Amazon forest would be a delicacy, but I would have a really hard time with it. So, even if I were in the Amazon forest. So, definitions of revulsion, while every culture has it, it's going to vary tremendously from one to another. I've always been curious about how we have decided that our garbage is repellent to us, and yet we continue to create it in such massive quantity and speed and persistence, but we are, the lovely English construction, we throw, which is very emphatic, away, which is very vague, are trash. And that's kind of charming and puzzling. And why have we decided that this category of object is just gross? And let's say the litter basket on the corner is full of only dry waste. You're still going to be taken aback a little bit when you see someone going through it for the recyclable cans or for art supplies or something, because it's already been segregated as something you shouldn't touch. It seems to me it points in part to the illusion of permanence and the simple fact that nothing lasts and how terrifying that is to us as human beings, the imminence of death, you know, all those kind of big ticket ideas that, well, people in this audience grapple with, but that generally the public doesn't, we don't. And sanitation workers make real the lie of the away and the lie of the disappearance and the lie of the invisibility. So we don't like them. Let's say they worked in business suits and the truck was always pristine, we still wouldn't like them because of all that, we link them to all those very big, scary ideas.
Right.
So it's always puzzling and so rich. Garbage is the best thing to study.
There's a city in Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities called Leonia, which...
It's across the river. It's a real
yeah. Which, I don't know if most people are familiar with the story, but it's about a tale about a city that refreshes itself daily. So it starts with new things at the beginning of the day and throws them away, and they just go away. And that is the lurking question in this city that is constantly new and renewing itself, is what is that away, where is it, and how do things go away?
Yeah.
And then the landfills that are created by this vomiting of stuff begin to grow
Encroach.
between the towns, and so
Yeah.
finally all you have is a little town surrounded by a vast landfill with another little town over here surrounded by a vast, like instead of a megalopolis of urban space, you have a mega dump.
And it threatens to effectively just slide over the entire city and cover it. So,
Like the novel The Woman of the Dunes, where the sand is perpetually swallowing up the homes of the...
I wonder maybe if we could turn and just answer one more question and then open things up for questions from the audience. It seems like it might be a good rhythm. And I was thinking about this when you were talking just now, Robin. You were talking about the big questions that waste causes us to ask ourselves, to think about permanence and impermanence and mortality. Perhaps the most physically revolting piece of waste, or troubling to all of us, would be a corpse, right? A dead human body. It's sort of the uncanny other, death and life. And I'm curious with the connection between waste and rubbish and the sacred, right? Because if it represents the profane and what we want to keep away, there's a very sort of short distance between that and what we find transcendent. I was just rereading Mary Douglas's book from the 60s, Purity and Danger, the other day, getting ready for this, and I was reminded in one of her early chapters that supposedly St. Catherine of Siena was worried that fastidiousness would keep her from doing her good work, so she drank a bowl of pus to mortify herself. So I thought I'd end with that. Good for her, right?
More power to her.
Maybe we don't have to be quite that dramatic, but is there a way in which we can think about the relationship between things that seem to be filthy or distasteful and a kind of social sense-making or form-making that may have a transcendent, spiritual, even religious component to it? And this is for anybody who wants to take it on.
well, I don't know about the spiritual part, but certainly the sense-making, probably the most compelling study I've read in that way is Alain Coben's The Foul and the Fragrant, where he studies the kind of rise of attention to odor as a way in which people would kind of deal with miasmas and public health and pollution, and to try to avoid contamination effectively, developed a whole set of sense-making practices that people became more attentive to the way things smelled, because they felt if you could smell something decaying, and that came from the corpse, obviously, among other things, that was the source of contamination. And then uses of perfume for the plague and different practices that really, galvanized a whole collective imaginary about sensation and pollution.
If Bill Rathje were here, he might talk about the perfume of garbage. He wrote a paper by that title, and he's arguing there about the role of garbage in archaeological analysis and how it's been central to the discipline since its earliest days, although even now archaeologists are hesitant to call the artifacts they find waste or garbage or rubbish. And of course Bill's work was centered on contemporary household waste. He started excavating garbage bags off the curb in the early 1970s. But if you look at where a system of people, where a culture places its value, we have sacralized our life of stuff to such a strange extreme I mean, we're not building churches anymore. We're building malls, you know?
Right.
And it's about buying a piece of the experience rather than just experiencing it. If you're a tourist, you have to bring home the trinket, the T-shirt, not just the postcard anymore. And I'm not sure what the answer is in terms of the connection between waste and the spiritual, but it does seem a step we might think about or come to take, seeing how linked they are in order to understand better how to change it.
It is a fascinating question. When did objects come to stand for us instead, to come to speak for us? And I think we live with this idea often that the system that we exist within is infinite. There could always be this sort of cycle of production with no sense of the byproducts, or at least that we don't have to deal with the byproducts. And at some point, maybe there will be a different way that cycle is affected. Anyone else?
What you just said about dealing with the byproducts.
Well, I think that because I'm thinking particularly of consumerism, this idea that we purchase things that somehow speak for us, they stand for us, the T-shirt from the vacation or the material things that we own or wear, without having a real sense of the life cycle of those objects.
Right.
And at some point that reality will be brought home to us just by the fact that we live in this planet and there's a limited amount of place to put these things.
Put it when it's done, and also to continue taking on the front end the raw materials that go into all
Absolutely.
these things. Yeah.
Right.
But I hope that's starting to change with the global warming movement, as I call it now. Just people are really starting to connect the front end and the back end. And I guess I was thinking about this, our separation from the natural world, not really thinking about where things come from when you're talking about the sacred and the profane, and that I'm not going to continue this. I haven't really worked it out.
Well, maybe we'll return to more of a connection with the natural world as we're forced to do that. One of my favorite nature writers is a man named Robert Michael Pyle, who writes about the Northwest U.S., and he has a saying in one of his books that goes something like this: nature bats last, that in the end we'll all be environmentalists because we'll have no choice but to do that, and perhaps that's where we'll end up. Yeah.
There's a new book called The World Without Us that has a chapter called The City Without Us, about, and it uses New York as the example. If all humans were suddenly not here, what would happen to the city? The subway shuts down within less than 48 hours because it's all below the water table and it would flood. But then how the buildings will slowly be reclaimed and things will... There's another, Anne Matthews has a book called Wild Nights, Nature Returns to the City, which also talks about how the processes are insisting upon themselves, almost despite us.
If you have questions, you have to come up to the mic.
Okay, well, this would be a good time to start taking those then.
Larry Cutler, retired. Would you say that the reason for this feeling of waste, there's such a contradiction that in a certain sense with matter nothing dies, on the other hand everything dies. It's both. Nothing dies, and it's inevitable that waste will be and always will be, and the spirituality, you can call it spirituality, but that comes from how you feel about it. But matter always is. That desk is going to die at some point.
But it can come back.
Right.
I mean, that's
Come back into something else.
right, and
That's right.
waste is food for something else. You can't have life without decay.
That's right.
Sure.
Spent a lot of time in a rainforest, and you notice how much there's, a gazillion decomposers there. Everything is rotting, and it's smelly, and it's wet, and all around you is death, and that's the basis for new life. And so it goes in the waste world also, more so before, but I think we have to come back around to that and seeing that keeping things cycling, and that's this whole new
Sure.
Well, see it as this thing, but maybe God, whatever that is, does not. It's just part of what is.
Yeah.
It decays.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of myself try to come to find that more and more reassuring that biological processes often, offer the kind of model for some sense of peace or transcendence, but it's a tough thing to come to sometimes.
Well, what smells is food waste and organic material, and that is, the best feedstock for new organic material. So.
Karen Rude. Are Americans uniquely wasteful? And do you envision ways in which we could enhance our awareness of waste, perhaps through better education? And if we are uniquely wasteful, how does that come about?
Yes.
You want to do it? Uniquely is a strong word, but I think yes too. I mean, certainly as compared with Australia, maybe. I haven't been to Australia, but there is an industrialized country that has plenty of space. Most of the industrialized world hasn't had as much space as we have, and therefore hasn't been as and has certainly, if you're thinking about Europe, has gone through more wars, and people have therefore been, even middle class and upper class people have had to fall back on those old-fashioned ways of mending and repairing and keeping things and making sure that they last. So, I mean, it's a sort of complicated question on top of the United States as, at least until recently, the epicenter of the consumer culture world,
There's also, and you write about this in Waste and One, and in some of your other work also, the way in which the new is so much more appealing than the traditional or the older. And one of the marks of the new has been disposability as a way of guaranteeing greater hygiene, as a way of indicating that you are of the modern era. The United States has been seen in the past as this harbinger of this new way of being a country. And our materiality has reflected this in, it used to be that you dried your hand on a roll of cloth, and now you find them now and then still, but that's kind of gross, right? Because somebody else, no, it's not. But some people would say that, or the tin cup that you took out of the train and you sipped it and put it back. We would not do that today. But so there are practices that, I mean, that also ties into definitions of, as I said, public health. But newness and freshness, and we do generate more pounds of trash per capita than any other nation by a rather remarkable stretch. I don't even know who is the second in that list, but we're so far ahead of them that it's...
China's coming.
China's coming, I'm sure. I'm sure probably India is also. I don't remember off the top of my head. Yes, you can actually look it up on UN websites, and some of the more statistically oriented environmental organizations will list those kinds of numbers. They're not hard to find.
We've got another question there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Charlie Garland. If you don't mind me mentioning the fact that I'm writing a book myself on the subject of innovation. And the way I define innovation, there is no way to disconnect it with the concept of waste at all. And I just wanted to make a bit of a comment and ask to maybe have you bring out a bit more information. When Robin just mentioned, if I have your name correctly, the connection between what we perceive as waste or garbage or trash, whatever, and how we as a society value different things. I see that as an absolutely solid continuum where waste is at one end of the spectrum conceptually, and value is merely that which we somehow connect between the waste, the things that we throw away in some obscure sense, and the things that other people do or don't value. I think that that's merely a concept in a continuum that by better understanding that throughout all the elements of our society, that's where it's going to be extremely helpful in all of us understanding what waste is, what it means to us, what it means to any individual, and how that ultimately is going to translate into the use, the reuse, or the appreciation of every characteristic that any item might have. But I'm wondering if you've seen any elements of that in things that you've written, things that you're teaching, things that you've read, with the concept of simply conceptually breaking items and assets down to their component parts and appreciating not only the assets themselves, but the characteristics of those assets and how they may be thought of and perceived and used for different values and different applications. Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm not sure I do either.
Can you reframe that?
Sure.
But
Yeah, I'm sorry.
dumb it down for me, because I didn't quite understand your logic.
For starters, can you describe the continuum that you're talking about?
Sure. I believe the first gentleman that got up and spoke a minute ago, I think, if I inferred correctly, he basically said that there really is no such thing as waste, and I kind of agree with that. Things, our perception of things that live and die, yes, but the matter that's broken down, it's still, there's functionality to every single thing. There's potential value in every asset in the world. So who values it, and why they value it, and what they value it for, what they see in it, may be completely different based on their orientation, their frame of reference, and their potential use. In the book that I'm writing, I am listing thousands of different, just seemingly stupid, everyday examples of things that typically people find incredibly resourceful uses of common objects that get thrown away. Example, I grew up in Cape Cod. People use empty Clorox containers as buoys all the time for their boats, for lobster pots and that sort of thing. I mean, it's a great example because to one person that's complete trash or complete, get it out of here, and for someone else it's a cherished asset to find. Exactly. And Mongo, in my mind, if you don't mind me saying, deserves to be considered not only as physical items but as conceptual thoughts. There's one of the folks that I've interviewed in my book already. You may or may not know there's a concept online in a product called Animusic, which is just an amazing display of animated music that is digitized in this. And he came up with an incredible way of using a characteristic of the data that comes from these digital things as this is a way to not just digitize music, but to drive the visual aspects of it too. It's an interesting reuse of something that otherwise was not valued at all. So what I'm really getting at, forgive the long-winded explanation, what I'm really getting at is, doesn't this really belong in the vision of, it's not just waste and what we kind of toss out to the side, but rather, doesn't everything really belong on a continuum of just value, and value as perceived by one individual versus another individual? Thank you.
Jennifer mentioned early on a book by a guy named Michael Thompson called Rubbish Theory. And he spends, well, I get lost in the mathematical chapters at the end, so I don't spend much time. But he puts forth the idea that value is, in fact, as you say, on a continuum. He puts it in a triangle of how things move from being valued to being rubbish to being in a transitional stage in between being worthless and being valuable. And he talks about various examples of that with housing or with a sort of a folksy sort of art form. And this is central to thoughts about material culture generally. And certainly if you're going to define something as waste or as worth keeping or worth imbuing with time and with self, that's the other thing about John Locke's idea, is that it's not just that a wasteland is unworked. There is the labor that you invest in it is a part of self invested in the thing or in the place, which then changes the relationship of it to the individual or to the larger society. So there are lots of thick and interesting conversations about exactly that idea. And Thompson would be a wonderful place to start. It's out of print, but I have some Xeroxes if you want a copy.
We have another question.
Yes, I'm Mary Era. Mary Era. I'd just like to recycle as much as I can. Just a couple comments and then a question. Just a couple of comments and then a question. The question of spirituality, where we waste things and how did it get to be such a nasty business. I think the puritanical aspect of, the quote, cleanliness is close to godliness is sort of an American way. We shower more than more people. If you go into our bathrooms, everything in there is a fragrance to cover and replace our natural scents. So starting with the body, and then anything we deem to be discarded as waste is therefore no longer good and no longer holy. I mean, to me, that's sort of a so it's pushed into the bad, garbage, deteriorating. There's also in this country youth, newness, and so therefore death and aging is not a positive attribute. So even with furniture, and to make it anything old stylish now, we have to call it retro to get it, whether it's clothing or whatever it is. If it's not retro, then it's just an old dress, And as far as the gentleman writing the book, I think if he followed up with a website with all these things, because the problem with the wonderful bleach bottle is finding the person who really needs it. He's up there, so it's easy to find. But if there's a website like we have 1,000 of this, who needs it? Kind of matching the Mongos.
Craigslist and free cycle.
Yeah, there's a new one too.
Is it called a Mongo list? and one last comment, then the question. In terms of Mongoism in New York City, I can tell you, living in a high-rise, the doormen and the porters in my building have decorated their apartments mainly with Mongoing before it even gets to the trash. So it's happening really quickly. The idea of going to dumps and stuff, having visited third world countries, they wouldn't consider it Mongo. To them, it's survival. And the little kids going there doing this, it's where they have to go, where it's not distasteful. It's what maybe it is, but the experience because of the odors and so on, but it's what they need to survive. And so I guess my question is this. Oh, by the way, also Madison Avenue, they make you have to buy everything new, so you can blame a lot on that, which is capitalism, the negative part of it. But anyway, I'm concerned about the acceleration of this because of globalism. The fact that we can buy so many things now for so little money, via Walmart, via China, it just accelerates. Poor people today have so much stuff that they used to not have 50 years ago because they were sewing on the buttons and so on. Now they just discard it. So this is continuing, and not only in this country but in Europe, but it's going to continue in China and India as all the whole planet lifts their, I'm talking too much, I'm sorry, but there's a lot of thoughts going on here. So I'm concerned about the future, not just the present, with this acceleration of the concept of just use and dispose. So I wonder if you have any stats on that, and actually what is happening to all the e-waste? I'm really curious about that. Where is it all right now? Thank you.
Do you want to start by talking where the e-waste is? I actually have something to say to the first part of the question. But.
Well, it's being broken down all over the world. There's more and more sort of recycling going on now in North America, but as the Basel Action Network has documented, as much as 80% of America's e-waste and as much as 70% of Europe's e-waste is going to places like China, Nigeria, India, Pakistan, where children and poorly paid workers generally break down the electronics for scrap and
wearing no protective gear, just
in very unsafe
cooking this
conditions.
stuff out on sidewalks, breathing in fumes.
And you can go to the Basel Action Network website to find out more about specifically, the kind of working conditions that people do have to labor in to break down electronics there.
To answer the first part of the question, we were talking about Michael Thompson's rubbish theory, and I just wanted to recommend an elaboration on it, which is Jonathan Culler's Framing the Sign, which has a chapter that's in response to it. And he suggests, he sort of disputes a bit, but then does quite a lot with Thompson's categorization of objects as being either durables, things, like diamonds or old master paintings that last forever and presumably become more valuable. Other objects that, I forget what the category is, transient maybe, that can become rubbish and then become recycled, and things that are just trash, things that are cast off. And he actually suggests that that may be another way of thinking about economic class or something according sort of concomitant to it, which is, do you think of your objects as being primarily transient, or do you think of the things that you own as being durable? It occurs to me that there are a great number of people in the world who are coming into a kind of consumer culture and being encouraged to purchase transient things, and that it's a kind of global maybe circuit or diffusing of our model of capitalism throughout the world.
Yeah, I would add to that the issue of change over time, and that more and more kinds of products become transient. When I was a child, furniture was not transient, and then IKEA showed up, and it is, so that the whole concept of fashion. I mean, certainly there were styles of furniture, but this is a new thing.
Even televisions and radios weren't. If you look at an old TV, it was a piece of furniture, right? It was beautiful. It was the centerpiece of the home, and now we expect that these are going to, turn over every 5 years or so.
We had a question over here.
Yeah, I had a few thoughts and a question about the cycle of my name is Adam Ludwig, by the way. The cycle of consumerism to waste to some form of renewal. One of the thoughts that I had when someone asked about whether we're the most waste-producing culture in the world is we may be, but we have the quickest turnover from consumerism to creating waste, I think, of any culture, which is like the hangover of buying something, some useless thing on a vacation becomes trash in probably the least amount of time of any culture. And then I was thinking of your comment about New York, like if it were to flood, how such this kind of fulcrum of consumerism would become paralyzed. And there was an interesting article in Harper's about Detroit, because if there's any city in America that is kind of experiencing the hangover of consumerism and experiencing the impact of becoming waste, it's Detroit. And it's interesting because the decay and the process of Detroit becoming garbage now is actually becoming its advantage in terms of a city that could be survivable in any kind of disaster because it's self-sufficient. They have farms. They're less dependent, like New York, on this kind of technological network that grows up out of consumerism. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, not just objects of waste, but places that become a kind of a place that represents waste, and how in that hangover from consumerism you can actually learn how to use the state of waste to as an advantage or as a stepping off point to some form of renewal.
It's a fascinating question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of examples. Fresh Kills would be one, a site that for many years was considered a real eyesore, an albatross, particularly for the residents of Staten Island, and then, it was closed and seen as a site of potential recuperation and value. But how you actually go about deciding what that recuperation is, who's involved, and how to revalue it, I think is a big question. And that article by Rebecca Solnit really raises some of those questions. It's a waste city, but for whom? Maybe to white people in the suburbs it appears to be waste, but maybe to the 80% black population living in the inner core it's not. Maybe it's actually a really great place to be because, and so it appears to be a ruin maybe from certain value structures, but maybe within others it's not. And so when you talk about recuperating it, well, who's recuperating it? Is it another sort of property speculation enterprise, or, so who's involved in recuperation, really?
There's also, if there were a way to see a city, let's say, as a kind of an organic entity, and the inputs that entity needs to survive, and then the outputs that are the waste and the sewage and the detritus of the city are all part of the whole. You can't segregate the waste from the vitality of it. and then think you have the whole city or the whole picture or the whole dynamic. If we were to expand our consciousness, to use a very hippie perhaps kind of phrase, or if we were to in some way reconceptualize the entirety, and it's like, I often think of it as having an infant. You don't not change the infant's diapers. You don't decide you don't love the infant because it poops. Its excretory processes are as inherent to its being as any other part of its physiological wellness. Or Elizabeth's examples from the jungle of the rot and decay, that is then also the spark of the life and the regeneration. And if you segregate your love for the one, we just don't love garbage, well, you aren't really loving the whole thing. And I hesitated all this afternoon to use the word love, but we got to throw it into here somewhere, because that's part of this knot of questions, I think.
Well, that gets back to the first question that was asked, really, is that everything becomes garbage. So perhaps it's time to reconcile ourselves to that, to the fact that everything does become waste, or there is waste bound up with everything, and actually address it and confront it, and maybe even use it as a point of creation.
That's what Don DeLillo says in The Wasteland. Is it The Wasteland?
Underworld.
Underworld, yeah. He's a waste technician. He looks at everything before he buys it and imagines what kind of waste it will make, even before he decides to buy it.
Hang out with sanitation workers, and you start to see the whole world that way too, very fast.
But it's very useful to ask yourself, will it be toxic? You know, is it going to, when it breaks, am I going to be able to fix it? And you will reduce your impact if you start thinking ahead.
I have an 8-year-old son, and I bought him a sweatshirt at Target yesterday. And I got him the size that fits him now, but it won't fit him probably by the spring. And today I said, I should have bought you the next size up. And he said right away, why? We can buy another one.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, I'm failing already.
Give another question here.
Thanks. My name is Frank Wilson, and I wanted to see if I can focus on one question which Susan's comments really hit me about, and it's that maybe I should try to ask the question first and then tell you why I'm asking the question. Maybe as a group, I assume that there are many psychoanalysts in this room, and what you throw away say about you as a self? What kind of a self have you constructed? The reason I asked the question is because I was reminded, because of your work, of a book written by a friend of mine who's from Australia, and the book is called Blokes and Sheds. And the book is really about a cultural difference, and I think it probably applies to Cuba as well, which is that in a society where you can't get replacements for things, people retain the tradition of using their hands to continue to make new things out of necessity, but also out of more than necessity. It's also out of the creation of a self-concept. That is, I am the things that I can build and create with my own hands and my own mind. I guess I'd like to hear more about that from you and the others as well. I also have a little comment about how we as a society got to be so good at throwing things away, and that's kind of a bit of wordsmithing, I think. In this culture, I think when we say bright, we mean shiny rather than intelligent. When we say brilliant, we don't really mean intelligent. We mean it's shiny as well. And I think that maybe one of the things in our culture that perhaps we ought to be working on as human beings is how to get people to take a more active role in creating a self out of doing things with their hands, rather than simply farming that out to somebody who makes software that does stuff for you.
Well, the question of the self and the trash, I think, comes in these assignments to the students that Bill and Robin are talking about. That Robin said she doesn't necessarily make the students tip it onto the table because it might be too self-revelatory. You know, what we throw out gives a lot of hints about what kind of life we lead.
But is there also shame in it? Is anyone ashamed of their garbage?
Well, the girl who tipped the table full of cigarette butts and empty beer bottles got a lot of ribbing from from her classmates. She confessed that it was while she was writing her final paper, so of course she was chain smoking.
But when I was going through my garbage for my book, I felt I was ashamed about my garbage because everything in there represented some sort of failure. Failure, either the product failed or I failed to find another use for it. I failed in buying it in the first place because it ended up here. So that was made manifest there, and all these little objects I was weighing and enumerating.
I never have weighed and enumerated my trash in the process of thinking about it, but there's no question that when you become more and more conscious of it, it starts to change how you live your daily life. I don't use paper towels. There are paper towels in my house. Every now and then people come and use them.
They just show up one day.
I mean, I turn old things into rags, and I use the rags, and I wash the rags, and there are still too many rags. That's one of the things that's really striking to me. That's
what I found.
Another piece of the question is that I was reminded about. Another piece of the question. I'm sorry.
Is the handwork question?
Well, I was thinking about all of you sort of discovering spontaneously that somebody tells you every 4 years that you're going to get a new computer, and wondering if you were an auto mechanic and you had a wall full of wrenches and somebody came around and said, we're going to take your wrenches away, what would your reaction be to that? It would be a very different one.
Well, and that's part of why our reaction is, I didn't get a chance to tell my story about that they want me to have a new computer. I have a laptop from the university because they've configured the classrooms in such a way that we can't just bring a flash drive, we have to bring a laptop. And so any of us who uses PowerPoint or whatever, you have to have a laptop from the university. It's an expensive way to go. So my laptop will become a department laptop when it's done. It's not going to go off into a landfill, and it's not going to be charity either. It will be used by graduate students or people whose laptops aren't working this week or whatever. But it's precisely because it's my tool and because we are at the point where we're switching over to Windows Vista, and they tell me my software isn't going to work, and I'm going to have to, there's a huge learning curve, and it's a huge amount of work for me to switch this laptop, the laptop that I've now got configured perfectly happily, to whatever this next laptop is. And so yeah, it's very much connected to my sense of myself and my work and my priorities and my general belief that I should get to, as a college professor with a certain status, get to make my own priorities rather than have the IT people tell me, now your priority is to spend your hours learning this new software. No, thank you, I don't want to do that. And I am in fact considering asking them to downgrade this laptop that is sitting in a box in my office, to downgrade it from Windows Vista to Windows XP so that I don't have to do any work, so that I can just, move from the old laptop onto the new laptop.
But that's such an interesting example, because you can't master the new tool by yourself. They're insisting on a new tool for you, and it's going to have a huge learning curve. The auto mechanic with his wrenches, he understands those wrenches.
Right.
If you take away the steel wrench and you give him a copper wrench, it's not going to work the same way, but he'll be able to figure out how to. The copper is going to be softer, and so it won't be as practical, but it's still, the wrenchness of it will not elude him in its use as a tool. Whereas electronic technology, even for those of us who work in higher education, they're telling me I'm going to have a guy come and reload things and upgrade and upload and press the buttons and make the sounds, and I'm going to sit there like an absolute idiot and wait for him to finish and then show me how to make it go, because I'm not conversant in that world at all, and everyone knows that, and everyone knows there's now these guys, the computer guys, they come around and they do this for you, because the tool of the wrench, we have gone so far past the capacity of why would you and I, or any of us, oh dear, I was about to say waste our time learning how to run computers. But that's unfair to computer people. It's just not my affinity or my talent. But I'm okay with a wrench.
I have a certain affinity and talent for it, and I was pretty good at DOS. And I really was, and I really resisted moving to Windows because I understood my computer, and I could see that I was being asked to take on it as the central tool for my work, something that I would no longer understand.
I wanted to comment on Woody Waldron, and I am actually an analyst. And here we are in the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and nobody has yet spoken about that earliest level, the anal phase, in which we deal with our own waste. And the question, but it's come up in a number of ways, for instance, shame about what you produced versus pride in what you produced. And I was particularly interested with the idea of a scale of value. Something is valued and is defined as waste. And I think there was a triangle too, although I forget what the triangular point was. And I think that it's really interesting to think about how we can deal with the waste production so that instead of just saying to people, like you say to a little kid, oh, very nice, when they actually move their bowels around, that's beautiful, so that the question of what work is entailed in making something and whether you value the result. I'm thinking of the fact that, interestingly enough, in New York about 20 years ago, a law was passed which said that dogs could no longer go on the sidewalks. And to everyone's astonishment, there was a cultural change, an immediate cultural change, and everybody started, cleaning up after their dogs. Perhaps, partly because of shame. You don't use, unless you're on the psychotic realm, you don't use the public streets as a place for yourself to go to the bathroom. And there's a law against it, but it's not so much the law that makes people. So if we can have an influence upon how people consider their waste, it could have a good effect. And I'll give one other slight example. So my daughter gave me a fleece about 15 years ago or something. I was so astounded to hear that came from old Coke bottles and, plastic of that type, so that I valued them more because I knew of what could happen to them. And I think that the whole question of sort of the PR of waste so that we can change the way things are dealt with to our own benefit is a very interesting area, and you people know a lot about it, I'm sure.
And a fleece was once what you spun off of a sheep.
Right.
It was not
from oil,
a
petroleum product.
Petroleum-based thread, yeah.
Yeah, the comment just strikes me as fascinating, though. I love this idea that we could potty train society, that we've been telling it the wrong thing so far, and I wish that there was that kind of progression. And just when I look at it in historical terms, I feel like we used to be potty trained, and we somehow lost that sense of things. And it's almost, and some of the authors that I work on, H.G. Wells has a wonderful novel called Tano Bunge, which is about a patent medicine scheme, and it's basically about unsustainable economics. It's a very funny book, not a science fiction book. It was Wells when he was being a regular novelist. And he basically is working through the anxiety of the idea that the categories of waste and value have somehow become reversed in early 20th century England. And the book is remarkably prescient if you look at our own culture. At the end, he thinks I've called this novel Tano Bunge, but I should have called it Waste. It's a society running to waste. We don't save or have any sense of our own practices. So.
Well, he'd be next, so I can go. My name's Mark Hoge. Rikers Island has a program for rehabilitating prisoners where they do waste recycling, and I don't know if any of you heard of it or what you think of it, or how, yes, composting, and how successful it is.
It was started by a guy named Vito Turso, who is now the Deputy Commissioner of Public Information at the Department of Sanitation. And he went from sanitation to Rikers and launched that program, and then went back to sanitation. And I've heard that it's quite successful. I don't know if I have the most recent news.
I don't know the recent either.
Rikers itself is a built island. It was built by garbage and fill across the late 1880s into the early 1900s, and then stank so badly that when Robert Moses wanted to put the first World's Fair in Flushing, he had to have it re-excavated and barged elsewhere because the stench would have ruined the success of his efforts.
Do you know what they do with the compost?
I don't.
My name is Roger Copeland, and this might be a question for Robin, because I suppose it involves one possible definition of loving waste. But I'm trying to remember a museum exhibition, and this is embarrassing, I can't remember where it was. Maybe Hallie will remember. It resulted in a catalog that with a title like...
Garbage.
No, more interesting than that, something like Sacred Waste. The premise of the exhibition, which involved a lot of performance pieces, if I'm remembering correctly, was that for the sort of quote-unquote progressive person who's sitting in this room at this moment, one of the last great taboos is to willfully, wantonly commit wasteful acts in public. So, for example, especially high-end kind of products. So people would be pouring bottles of Dom Perignon onto the floor rather than into glasses, or burning $100 bills. And I can imagine how cringe-making it would be to watch such activities. And I'm just curious, does anybody remember what I'm trying to recall? What the name of this book was? I know I saw the catalog at the Walker Art Center bookstore not too long ago, but...
Well, Hallie and I see an exhibit in Vienna where it's I'm not going to, but it's simply that it was a piece called Cloaca.
Oh yeah, that was here.
Oh yeah, it was here.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, aestheticized. The ultimate aesthetic piece of art is that it made shed. It was a shed. And even had some degree of smell to it, didn't it?
Well, it had a smell, but they put a plexiglass box around the back end because the gallery goers were offended.
Yeah.
So to me, that lost half the meaning of it right there.
My name's Ann Bradley, and I'm going to ask my question and sit down so I can take notes on your answers. But I'm just concerned about sort of the ethics of throwing things away. I mean, I live here on the Upper East Side, and I constantly see things. Just last week, I was walking by a building next door, and there were 3 huge plastic bags of perfectly good clothing that had been just left on the street, for trash. And given the need in the world, I realize recycling food is a bit more problematic, even though, 20% of New York City children go to bed hungry or something, live below the poverty level. I just would like your reflections on the ethics of trying to recycle versus the practicality, and whether that moral dimension enters the conversation very often.
Well, I think there's a huge moral dimension, and I also think that there's a kind of taboo about talking about moral things in general.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think of it in terms of, what I guess would be called source reduction, which, simply at the most basic level is not preparing or taking more food than one needs. I mean, that is a kind of moral act, but not one that we always are encouraged to think about in our culture.
I should say, as a student, more of consumer culture than of waste per se, I find myself constantly struggling with my own moral sense about consumer culture, and my sense that it's something that I shouldn't talk too much about. And I guess what's striking to me is that in the end, the environmental argument, and as you say, now we can call it the global warming movement, is starting to look different than the environmental movement has for a long time. The environmental argument is the fundamental argument against consumer culture, and so may bring us out of the necessity to be talking about it in moral terms that people have a hard time listening to, and have a hard time accepting.
Somebody who actually talks about the ethics of recycling in a kind of interesting way, because she kind of problematizes it, is Gay Hawkins, a waste scholar who's based in Australia. And she actually examines the way in which sort of post-1960s environmentalism became wrapped up with these sort of practices of recycling that maybe in some ways even obscured our relationship to waste, because it was so sort of automatic and shameful. And you know, you wash things, you sort them, you put them out for collection, and that maybe it might even foreclose other ethical possibilities in relation to waste. So while this felt like an ethical practice, maybe there was more that we hadn't considered, and maybe that recycling even needed to be cracked open so that we could get at other possibilities. And I find that an interesting argument, because waste does so quickly get sort of collapsed into simply recycling.
Sure, right. And I mean, I've heard the argument made, and I think it's pretty convincing that recycling on some level ends up serving as a justification for the perpetuation of the wasteful practices that we exist in. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't recycle, but if we think that that's somehow solving all of the problems.
If I could ask one question to the last questioner. I'm sorry, I just had a quick question for you. How did you know those bags were full of clothes?
They were clear plastic.
Oh, they were clear plastic. Okay.
And there was already a homeless person who was going through them as I walked by. He said, "Would you like a leather coat?"
Okay. Would you have taken something?
Yeah.
See, it's not. It isn't a question. It's a comment. You know, when
What's your name?
Maxine Zafman, and I'm a psychoanalyst, retired. You know, when I came, I thought waste and modernity was going to be about our America, that just is such a consumer society while the rest of the world is suffering from poverty and no drinkable water and other things. Because what is so terrible here is that everybody, I think at this period, has such a need to have possessions. You know, it is a moral question, you know, that really is so terrible for me. I know that, you know, I lived in Europe for 6 years in Paris. I translated the Marshall Plan at the embassy. And, you know, people had very few toys for their children. I had no toys because I grew up in the Depression. You know, we had sticks that made dolls. And we, you know, and we cared. You know, I came from a family that was workman circle Jewish, you know, where you cared about poverty. You helped. There was an enormous amount of your money that went to helping other people. It wasn't that you had every bloody modern, you know, piece of everything. And 90 million, you know, the teenagers now have their rooms piled like this with clothing and the cosmetics, you know, you can't even see the number of baskets. You know, we don't care about the poverty. We don't use our money to help, you know, world, you know, Africa not have starvation. You know, there's so many thousands, millions of people dying of starvation, and we have to have every bloody thing. I know my daughter gave away 7 carloads of enormous, hideous plastic things, you know, as her kids grew up, because her mother-in-law every week had to buy another toy for this grandson. You know, I mean, we've lost not only a sense of who we are, but what we are as a nation, you know, and our decency, you know, and our caring, you know, about world issues. And, you know, we have starvation in America. It's not only in Africa, you know. So, I don't know, I thought that was a little bit what we were going to talk about. And so I was very glad when you raised that moral issue.
I think it's behind everything we have talked about. Thank you for putting it so eloquently.
Sally Lindsay, my name is. How do we cope with a capitalistic society which is forcing us into more consumerism and more waste? Everything we buy falls apart and has to be thrown out. So how do we deal with that? And where do we go from here?
Do we start the revolution?
Rejecting. We reconnect in small communities. We go back to these values. We read Bill McKibben's new book, Deep Economy, about reconnecting communities. And Bill McKibben, it's what is the subtitle? It's about. I'm sorry, I can't think of the subtitle, but it is about rejecting hyper-individualization and relying on neighbors and buying locally and even having your own currency in your own community so that you keep your money within and you're supporting people in your neighborhood and you ride the bus and you don't have your iPods in your ears and you listen to all the same music and whether you like it or not.
And just to sort of play off the last comment, which I thought was so wonderful and passionate, instead of buying toys to tell people that we love them, telling them that we love them, or making them something that tells them that instead.
Right. There are people who now
making gifts instead of buying gifts.
Right. He talks about that, and he also quotes studies that say, but buying all this stuff is not making anyone any happier. We're not better off for all this stuff.
And turning off
psychologically.
the TV. I think turning off the TV is huge.
Right. We don't have the messages.
Just turn off, maybe even get rid of the TV.
Couple of comments. One, I thought Woody would say something about this. You had mentioned you don't understand why when you walk towards the garbage, for example, you are not that eager to go into it and open it up. Well, the reason is because beginning when the child is about 2 or so, he wants or she wants to play with their own feces, and what we do is we tell them it's disgusting and you shouldn't go near it and so on. And it has there are health reasons for that, but it's also what we teach them, and so that continues throughout your life. You make the same association every time you're near smelly garbage. It's inevitable. Now, when I went to medical school, it was the pre-MRI period and at the tail end of the golden age of diagnosis, but we still had to learn to overcome that because there is so much you can learn from smelling urine or to looking at feces for medical diagnostic purposes. That aside, I think the conversation is turning a little bit too much in a certain direction, which is all bad. And it's not all bad. I think there is a fantastic progress between the DOS and whatever program it is I'm using now. Windows. So there is a positive to the progress that we have technologically, scientifically, and so on, and there is a cost to it. So the problem is trying to figure out how we deal with the cost, but not knock down the progress.
My name is Matthew Von Unworth, and I have a couple of, I think, related questions. One follows up on the psychoanalytic remarks, which is that the people that have talked so far have dealt with the sort of superego aspect of it, the morality, the disgust. But the anal phase of analysis is also the period in which a child deals with his or her own power and powerlessness, and more importantly, perhaps, the boundaries between himself and what is not himself in the world. And in thinking about how people are discussing this, I guess I almost think that the issues that are called up by the disgust of waste or by our desire to repress it in various ways seems a symptom almost of a failure to work through an existential state of powerlessness or of where our boundaries are in the world. I was also wondering if what was said in the Bible about waste, because it occurred to me that this is a very secular conversation that has to do very much with sort of the accounts of waste without getting into it. And I have a feeling that my own sense is that I would guess that it wasn't spoken of so much in the Bible, and that it's something that even the movement of the thought, the interest in waste, is something that we look at at a distance, and that it's a particularly secular movement. That there's a desire to be exterior from the things that are threatening to us, that we even think of them as waste.
Yeah.
All right. So those are my questions.
Aren't there good reasons for wanting to stay away from waste?
Well,
the things that smell, the sulfurous and nitrogenous compounds, are from putrefying food that if we ate it, the Freegans are eating food that is really well wrapped up. And do they acknowledge that one of the benefits of they're critiquing society and our overpackaging and our obsession with hygiene and all this, but if this food wasn't so wrapped up, they wouldn't be gleaning it at night
But
with confidence.
Yes, they're aware of that, but perhaps there needn't be so much of it that never actually gets eaten. It's sort of the pornographic, overzealous production of it that is at the heart of what they...
But this thing about, does the Bible talk about things being unclean and not touching?
It does. I was thinking
Yeah.
Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I mean, those are the places that I think of waste being in the Bible. And
it's for health reasons.
well, it's actually not. I mean, all Mary Douglas's argument in Purity and Danger is that people for a long time thought that it was for health reasons, that you get trichomoniasis or whatever from eating pork. But in fact, if you start to look at it, they're really funny too. If you look at the prohibitions, like you're not supposed to eat things that have a cloven hoof, and I'm going to get this wrong. I think they have to have a cloven hoof and chew a cud, and if they don't do both of those, then it's a problem. So there are things like the rock badger you're not supposed to eat.
Which locust are you allowed to eat? And there's another locust. You can eat the locust that crawls, but not the one that flies, or vice versa.
Swarming is bad, I know.
Swarming is bad.
It's just a control thing in the Bible.
Well, no, I think it's how sort of sacred meaning is made, which is you have these animals like the pig, for example, which has the cloven hoof but doesn't chew a cud, that it defies a category, or you have things that wriggle like eels and they defy the category of fish. So they defy this sense that there are clean boundaries between things, that certain things are set apart. And I believe that the origin of the word that gets translated as holy actually means set apart. So God says, I am set apart, and you shall be set apart as well. And it's a system of making social meaning and of ordering the world and of sort of calling the sacred down rather than anything. I mean, there may be some, ancillary health effects that are good, but if you look at those prohibitions, I don't think that that's consistently why they're there.
But there are also different meanings of waste in the Bible. The waste of the wilderness that you go into for a certain kind of introspection and, to move beyond the boundaries of the self and to deal with probably that powerlessness that you're talking about. So there are a lot of shifting meanings.
Yeah, that would be sort of waste as the uncultivated area versus, I guess, pollution was really more what I was talking about with those codes.
Probably wasn't much material waste back then.
Yes. One of the first things that comes to my mind.
What's your name?
Mel Melchman. Waste is, and probably the most problematic, as far as I'm concerned, is nuclear waste. And I'm so curious why that hasn't come up. Is it just that no one comes in contact with it, so we don't know about it, or is it just too new?
Well, in fact, we may be all coming into contact with it. I have a friend who works for the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, I think, NIRS, who has been doing a lot of work about the reprocessing of nuclear waste, and apparently it's being put into consumer products. I mean, it's really...
Like what? Like smoke detectors? Like that?
Well, there is the smoke detector.
I know it's repressed into munitions, actually. It gets used in hardened piercing armor in Iraq, for example.
Wait, what's the one?
It does make a lot of nuclear waste, and also there is waste with all the medications that are now in the water, in the drinking water system.
I was thinking about the nuclear power issue, and these they got put into mines, and this, it lasts forever, and that whole... Seems like that's the most dangerous waste we've got.
Well, the gap that you've just identified points to the problem of talking about this subject inclusively in an afternoon. We haven't talked about agricultural waste, we haven't talked about mining waste, we haven't talked about hazardous household as a subcategory of household, we haven't talked about, which is just to say that yes, nuclear waste is a huge, scary problem. And so are so many other categories and subcategories of waste. And in one afternoon, particularly when linked with the title of modernity, which I took to be a little more highfalutin and kind of theoretically tweaked. And I'm grateful that it has been we've gotten theoretical and very practical, which is nice. But yes, let's give it another 2 hours and we'll include nuclear waste. And we'll include...
But I think the interesting thing about nuclear waste, too, is the way in which nuclear power is posited as an alternative to our energy technologies that create certain kinds of atmospheric waste, carbon, and so nuclear technology is seen as an alternative, but we haven't had to really confront that waste, or we haven't confronted that waste in a way.
And
that would show that what a problem that waste is. So it's kind of delaying and distancing it.
It really is its own special category. I mean, I don't think there's ever been any waste that we've created that has anything close to that kind of lifespan. I mean, you know, I've heard the problem. What are you going to put as a sign, you know, in the repository where the waste is, whether it gets drilled into the salt flats in the desert? You know, I think it's something like 10,000 years. No human language has ever survived that long. And, you know, it is a kind of fascinating question that brings the realm of the, at least from our perspective, eternal into something that we think of as being quite temporal.
The revenge of waste.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yes.